Welcome to Damon Revenge Stories. Get ready for tales of sweet revenge.
My name is Nicholas Williams. I'm 32 years old, and I work on diesel engines down at the Norfolk shipyard. The kind of engines that move ships the size of small cities across oceans most people will never see. 3 weeks ago, on a Tuesday evening that smelled like rain coming in off the Chesapeake, I sat alone at my kitchen table in a one-bedroom apartment I could barely afford, holding a wool pea coat that had belonged to a man I buried when I was 14 years old. My father's coat, Navy issue, heavy as a wet dog, and the lining along the left breast had something hard inside it. I'd carried that coat home from a storage unit 2 weeks earlier, and hadn't been able to bring myself to open the bag it was in until that night. When I finally cut the seam with my pocket knife and pulled out a small brass key labeled First National, Box 1177, my hand started shaking so hard I dropped it on the table twice. I didn't know yet what was waiting in that box. I didn't know yet that everything I had believed about my father for 18 years was a lie my mother had built, brick by brick. What I found sewn into that lining changed everything I believed about my father, and what came next changed everything about who I was willing to be. Before I tell you the rest, do me one favor. If you've ever loved someone who's gone, if you've ever had a feeling in your gut that the story you were told about your family wasn't the whole truth, take a second right now and hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment below. Tell them your name. Wo. Your stum. Visau razor is she. Alaristaman. Alphum free. This channel is for people who survived families that should have protected them and didn't. And the more of us who find each other here, the less alone any of us has to be. Welcome back, if you've been here before. If you're new, pull up a chair. I'm going to tell you everything, the way it actually happened, in the order it actually unfolded. Because the only way I can make sense of what my mother did to me for 18 years is to lay it out the way I lived it, beat by beat. To understand how I ended up holding that key, you have to go back to the morning my father didn't come home. I was 14. It was a Thursday in October, and my mother woke me up at 6 a.m. by sitting on the edge of my bed and saying, in a voice that was already practiced, that my father had passed away the night before. Heart attack, she said, at the kitchen table. She found him when she came down to make coffee. I remember sitting up and feeling like the room had tilted, like the floor was no longer level. I remember asking if I could see him, and she said no. The paramedics had already taken him, and that was for the best, because he wouldn't have wanted me to remember him that way. I remember she didn't cry. Not that morning, not at the funeral, not at any point after. She wore a black dress that she'd bought a month earlier for a wedding, and she stood at the front of the church with her hand on my shoulder and accepted condolences with the calm efficiency of someone running a school bake sale. My sister Rachel was 11. She cried for both of us. My father was a Navy man, 22 years in. He'd been a chief petty officer on destroyers, and the year he died, he'd just retired and taken a contract job with a marine engineering firm in Virginia Beach. He smelled like diesel and salt, water, and aftershave. And when he was home, which wasn't often, he'd take me down to the docks on Saturdays and let me crawl around the engine rooms of the ships his friends worked on. He didn't talk much. He'd point at things and explain how they worked, and I'd nod, and he'd tell me I had good hands, which I think was the highest compliment he knew how to give. He was 46 when he died. That's what I was told. I have no way of knowing now whether even that was true. Within a week of the funeral, my mother sat Rachel and me down at the kitchen table and explained the situation. Our father, she said, had left us nothing but debts. Gambling debts, mostly. She said he'd been hiding it from her for years, that he'd run through his Navy pension borrowing against it, that he'd taken out credit cards in her name and maxed them out. She said the life insurance he was supposed to have through the Navy had lapsed because he hadn't kept up the premiums. She said we were going to have to be very careful with money now, and that Rachel and I needed to understand that things were going to be different, I remember nodding. I remember Rachel asking if we were going to lose the house, and my mother saying that depended on how hard we all worked. I was 14 years old, and from that day forward, I believed that my father, the man who had taught me how to listen to an engine and tell what was wrong with it just by the sound, had left us broke and ashamed because he couldn't control himself. That belief shaped everything. It shaped how I thought about him. It shaped how I thought about money. It shaped how I thought about myself because I was his son. And if he was weak, then maybe I was weak too. And I had to work twice as hard to prove I wasn't. When I turned 18 and got my acceptance letter to Old Dominion University, my mother sat me down again and explained that college wasn't going to be possible. Your father's debts, she said, we're still digging out. If you go to college, the house goes. And where does that leave your sister? She said it like it was a question I was supposed to answer. I told her I'd skip college. I got a job at the shipyard as an apprentice mechanic because I had good hands, like my father said, and because diesel engines were the one thing in the world that made sense to me. Within a year, I was sending my mother $1,200 a month out of my paycheck to help with the mortgage. I did that every month for 14 years. Do the math on that. I did it once, sitting in a parking lot, and I had to put my head down on the steering wheel. The rest of it came in pieces, slow enough that I never quite saw the pattern. When I was 22, I applied for a credit card at the shipyard's Federal Credit Union and got denied. The clerk slid the paperwork back to me and said my credit was already overextended, that there was a loan in my name for $38,000 that I was 4 months behind on. I drove home that night and confronted my mother, and she cried. She actually cried that time, the first time I'd seen her cry since the funeral. And she told me she'd had to take the loan out in my name because there were back taxes from my father's estate that had finally come due, and she didn't have the credit to cover them. And she was so sorry. And she'd been making the payments, but she'd fallen behind because of medical bills. I believed her. I added the loan payments to what I was already sending. When I was 25, she needed dental surgery, and I paid $14,000 for it. And 2 weeks later, her church group sent me a card thanking me for being such a good son and mentioning how brave my mother was for taking care of her own dental work on her fixed income. I didn't understand that one until later. When I couldn't afford to also pay for the cruise she wanted to take with her sister, she told her friends I was selfish, and word got back to me through a cousin. And when I asked her about it, she said the cousin was lying. When Rachel got married at 26, my mother bought her a Lexus as a wedding gift. A brand new one. I found out from a photograph my aunt posted online. Rachel standing in front of it with a giant red bow on the hood. I called my mother and asked, how she'd managed that, given everything. She told me I was making it about myself. She actually sent me a text message that said, in those words, "Don't make this about you." I didn't go to the wedding. I told them I had to work. Rachel didn't speak to me for a year. When I was 29, I met a woman named Megan. She was a paralegal who worked downtown, and she laughed at my jokes about boat engines, and within 6 months, I was talking about rings. I brought her home for dinner once. Just once. My mother was charming until Megan went to the bathroom. And then my mother leaned across the table and said, very quietly, that she wanted Megan to know something about me before things got serious. That I had a temper, like my father. That my father had been violent when he drank. That he'd hit her. That I'd seen it as a child and probably didn't remember. But that those patterns were genetic. None of that was true. None of it. My father never raised a hand to anyone in his life that I ever saw. And he drank 1 beer on Friday nights and that was it. But Megan heard it. And she didn't tell me until later, and by the time she did tell me, she'd already decided. She broke up with me a month after meeting my mother, When I told my mother, she patted my hand and said Megan wasn't right for me anyway. I remember thinking, in that moment, that she sounded almost pleased. That was the texture of my 20s, working 12-hour shifts on diesel engines so I could send my mother her money, watching her live a life that looked, from the outside, like the life of someone who had pulled herself up by her bootstraps after a tragedy. She had her church group. She had her bridge club. She had a paid-off house, mostly paid off by me, and a car I made the payments on, and a closet full of clothes she bought with the credit card I kept in good standing for her. And I had a one-bedroom apartment, a 2011 pickup truck with 200,000 miles on it, and a permanent low hum of guilt for not doing more. The first crack in the story came at Thanksgiving, when I was 30. My Aunt Deborah, my father's sister, was visiting from Richmond. She'd had a glass and a half of wine, which was a glass and a half more than usual, and she was telling stories about my father from when they were kids, the kind of stories I'd always wanted to hear, and my mother had always cut short. Deborah was in the middle of saying something about my father's old Mustang, when she trailed off and said, half to herself, well, that was before all the insurance mess anyway. I looked up. My mother was across the table. I watched her face change. I watched her reach over and grab Deborah's forearm, not gently, and lean in and say something in Deborah's ear that I couldn't hear. Deborah's expression closed up like a slammed door. She made an excuse about needing to get on the road before dark, and she grabbed her purse and left within 15 minutes. 2 weeks later, I would understand why Aunt Deborah grabbed her purse and left. That Thanksgiving, I had no idea. I asked my mother later what insurance mess Deborah had meant, and my mother said Deborah had been confused, that there had never been any insurance, that I knew that we'd been through it 100 times. I dropped it, but the question sat in the back of my head for a year and a half, the way a splinter sits under the skin, irritating without quite hurting, until something finally drew it out. The something was a storage unit. My mother called me in October when I was 31 and asked if I could clean out the storage unit she'd been renting out by the airport. She said she couldn't afford the rent anymore, which was rich coming from someone whose mortgage I was paying, but I said yes, because I always said yes. I drove out there on a Saturday morning. The unit hadn't been opened in years. There were boxes of Rachel's old schoolwork, a broken lamp, a sewing machine, and at the very back, under a tarp, my father's old footlocker from the Navy. I'd never seen it. I sat down on the concrete floor of that storage unit and opened it, and the first thing on top was his peacoat. Heavy wool, brass buttons, the navy blue so dark it was almost black. I held it up to my face, and it didn't smell like him anymore. Not really. But underneath the dust, there was something, some ghost of diesel and salt and the man who used to lift me up to look at engines. I sat there for, I don't know how long, holding that coat, before I folded it up, put it in a trash bag, and took it home along with the footlocker. I told my mother I'd thrown most of it out. She said, good, that stuff was just clutter. I didn't look at the coat for 2 weeks. I couldn't. It sat in the bag by my front door, and every time I walked past it, my chest got tight. Finally, on a Tuesday night in November, I poured myself a beer and sat down at the kitchen table and pulled it out. I was going to hang it in my closet. That was all I meant to do. But when I picked it up, my hand brushed something hard along the left breast, inside the lining, between the wool and the satin. I felt around. There was definitely something there, small and rigid, sewn in. I got my pocket knife out of the drawer. I worked the seam open carefully, 3 inches along the bottom hem of the lining, and I reached in and pulled out a small brass key, attached to a tiny paper tag with my father's handwriting on it. First National Bank, box 1177. I stared at it for a long time. My hands started shaking. I put the key on the table and just looked at it. Then I picked up my beer, drank the whole thing in one swallow, and went into the bedroom and laid on top of the covers with the lights on for about an hour, trying to slow my heart down. Because I knew. Before I'd even gone to the bank, before I'd opened the box, I knew. the aunt's comment at Thanksgiving, the way my mother had grabbed her arm, the insurance mess. My father had hidden a key in his coat, sewn it into the lining where no one would ever find it, and labeled it First National. He'd done that on purpose. He'd done that because he knew. He knew my mother. He knew what she would do, and he had built a backup. Close to my heart, I thought later when I read his letter. That's what he meant. The key is where I always hid things. Close to my heart. I went to First National the next morning. I'd called in sick to work, which I'd done maybe 3 times in 14 years. The branch was in a strip mall in Norfolk, a brick building with that 90s bank look. I walked in and showed the key to the woman at the customer service desk and said, I was here to access box 1177. She looked at the key, looked at her computer, asked for my ID. I gave her my driver's license. She typed for a long time. Then she looked up at me, and her face went very still, and she said, Sir, this box is registered to a Mr. James Williams. Are you related? I said he was my father. He died in 2006. She nodded slowly and said, The box has a cosigner. Nicholas James Williams. That's you. The signature on file. She turned her monitor so I could see, and there was my name in my father's handwriting, written when I was 13 years old, and underneath it, my own signature, also at 13, which I had no memory of giving. He'd taken me to the bank one Saturday when I was a kid and had me sign a sign card. I didn't remember it. He'd been planning this for a year before he died. She led me back to the vault. She set down her pen, looked at the documents, then looked at me and said, Sir, you need to sit down. There's a private room. I'll bring the box to you and give you as long as you need. I sat in a small room with carpet that smelled like cleaning solution and waited. She came back with a long metal box and set it on the table and closed the door behind her. I opened it. On top was a manila envelope with my name on it in my father's handwriting. Under that, a thicker envelope, also with my name. Under that, an insurance policy on heavy bond paper. I started with the policy because I think I was afraid of the letters. The policy was a whole life insurance contract from Mutual of America, taken out in 1998 when I was 8 years old. Face value, $740,000. Sole beneficiary, Nicholas James Williams, son. There was a payout statement clipped to it, dated March of 2006, 6 weeks after my father's death. The payout had been processed. The check had been issued. The check had been mailed to an address in Norfolk that was not our house. I read the address 3 times before I recognized it. It was the address of my mother's sister, who had moved to Florida in 2009. My mother had used her sister's address to intercept the check. Then I opened the manila envelope. Inside was a notarized affidavit my father had prepared in 2005, anticipating that something exactly like this might happen. It explained the policy, named me as beneficiary, named my mother as someone who had repeatedly tried to access the funds and been refused, and stated in plain language that if I was reading this document, it meant his wife had likely intercepted the payout and that I should hire an attorney immediately. Attached to it was a photocopy of a claim denial letter from 2006, the supposed denial my mother had told the family about, which she had told everyone meant there was no insurance. It was forged. The signature at the bottom was not the signature of the claims adjuster, whose name was typed underneath. My father had attached a sample of the real adjuster's signature, obtained from earlier correspondence, for comparison. The forgery was obvious. A child could have seen it. I sat in that little room, and I didn't cry. Not yet. I was too far past crying. I opened the second envelope. Inside was a letter, handwritten on lined paper, 5 pages long, dated from his final deployment in 2005. I'm going to tell you what it said, but not here. Not yet. Because I didn't read it all the way through that day either. I read the first page and had to stop. The first page started with the words, "Son, if your mother told you I left nothing, she lied." I read that sentence, and I read it again. And I put the letter back in the envelope, and I put everything back in the box. And I asked the woman at the desk if I could leave the box in the vault for now and come back. She said, of course. I drove home. I called in sick for the rest of the week. I sat in my apartment for 2 days without leaving, just thinking. If someone in your family controls the story of who your parents were, if you were never allowed to ask questions, if you grew up believing things about people you loved that maybe weren't true, maybe the answers are still out there waiting for you. Maybe they're in a box, in a coat, in a letter somebody hid because they knew. What would you do if you found them? Tell me in the comments. I'd like to know I'm not the only one. The math hit me on the second day. I sat down with a notebook and a calculator and I worked it out. $1,200 a month for 14 years. $201,600 plus the $38,000 loan, which she'd never paid back, which I'd spent the bother for. That consider part of a decade paying off, plus $14,000 for the dental surgery, plus God knows how many smaller things. Probably another $40,000 or $50,000 across various emergencies that turned out to not be emergencies. Call it $300,000 conservatively, that I had handed my mother over 14 years, while she sat on a $740,000 life insurance check that belonged to me. I spent 18 years apologizing for existing because she told me my father didn't love me enough to provide. And the whole time, the proof that he did was sitting in a box 12 miles from my apartment. 12 miles. I drove past that bank probably 100 times a year. I had a checking account at a competing bank 1 block away. I went back to First National on the 3rd day. And I read the rest of the letter. I read it slowly. I had to stop multiple times. I am going to share it with you the way I read it, in pieces, because that's how it landed. He started with this: "Son, if your mother told you I left nothing, she lied." I set this aside because I know your mother. I know what she does when she is scared, and I know what she does when she is greedy, and I know that those two things in her are the same thing. She has always needed to be the center of everything. And after I'm gone, she will need that more than ever. And you will be the one she uses to stay there. I am writing this in the wardroom of a destroyer in the Persian Gulf. Son, and I don't know if I'll make it back from this deployment, but I know that whether I die out here or live to be 80, your mother is going to outlive me. And when she does, she is going to tell you a story about me. I want you to know before she tells it what the truth is. I sat in that bank room, and I had to put the letter down for 10 minutes before I could pick it up again, because he knew. He knew. He'd written this in 2005, a year before he died, and he had known exactly who she was, and he had loved me enough to leave behind a record of the truth. He went on. "The truth is that I have loved you since the day you were born, and I have tried to be a better father than the man who raised me. And I know I have failed in some ways, especially in being gone so much, especially in not protecting you from your mother's moods. Used to hide in the garage with me when she was angry. Do you remember that? You'd come out and sit on the workbench and watch me change the oil in the truck, and we wouldn't say anything. And that was the closest I knew how to get to you. I'm sorry I didn't know more ways. I wanted to learn. I thought I'd have more time. I read that line, and I put my head down on the table in that little bank room, and I cried for the first time since I'd been a child. I remembered the garage. I remembered sitting on the workbench with my legs swinging and watching him work, and the smell of the motor oil, and the way he'd hand me a wrench sometimes and not say anything. And I'd hand it back when he was done. I had forgotten that. I had forgotten that there were moments when I had felt safe with him. He continued, "The policy is for you, son, not for your mother. I took it out when you were 8 years old because I had a bad feeling on a deployment, the kind of feeling you get when you've been on the water too long. And I came home and I went to the insurance office and I put it in your name." I never told her. I knew if I told her, she would find a way to get to it. The premiums come out of an account she doesn't know about, at a bank she doesn't use. I have paid them faithfully for 7 years now, and I will keep paying them as long as I can. If you are reading this letter, it means I am gone, and it means you found the key, and it means you have a chance to know what really happened. He named her specifically. He named the people in her life who would help her. He even named Pauline, her best friend, and wrote, "Pauline knows your mother better than your mother knows herself. And Pauline has a conscience even when your mother does not. If things get bad enough, Pauline will tell the truth." I have always believed that about her. Do not be afraid to look her in the eye. And then the part that broke me open. You are not a burden, son. You never were. Your mother needed you to believe that, so you would never stop paying. She has needed people to pay for her whole life, and you were the one she decided would do it after I was gone. It is not your fault that you believed her. She is your mother. You were a child, but you are not a child anymore. And now you have the truth, and what you do with it is up to you. I am sorry I couldn't protect you from her while I was alive. This letter, this box, this is my protection from beyond. Use it. Build a life. Find someone who loves you the way you deserve to be loved. Have children if you want them. And tell them about me. And tell them I tried. I love you, son. I always did. Your father, James. I sat in that bank room for 2 hours after I finished reading. I didn't cry the whole time. Sometimes I just sat. Sometimes I read parts of it again. I noticed things. The way he wrote my name with a little extra space before it. Like he was taking a breath before he said it. The way he signed it. Your father, James, like he wanted me to have both. The way the handwriting got a little shakier toward the end. Like he'd been writing for a long time and his hand was tired. Or like he'd been crying himself. I will never know which. I will never know. That is the part that doesn't go away. I have the letter, but I will never have the man. I drove home that night, and I sat on my couch, and I called the only person I could think to call, which was a guy named Marcus, an attorney I'd done some work for. Fixed his boat's diesel a couple of times, who'd told me once that if I ever needed legal help to call him. I told him the short version. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Nicholas, come to my office tomorrow morning. Bring everything. We're going to fix this." Marcus became the closest thing to family I'd had in years. He pulled records. He confirmed the forgery. He confirmed the address on the payout check. He confirmed that the $740,000 had been deposited into an account in my mother's name and then moved over the course of 3 years into a different account she'd opened in Rachel's name, where most of it still sat, untouched, because she'd been afraid to spend it visibly. She'd been sitting on it for 18 years. She'd been making me pay her mortgage while she sat on $750,000 of my money. Marcus laid out my options on a yellow legal pad, drawing little squares for each path with a black felt-tip pen. Civil suit, criminal referral to the state's attorney, quiet recovery through her insurance, since the carrier had paid out fraudulently. He tapped each square as he explained it, and the room smelled like old coffee and printer toner, and the radiator in the corner clicked every few minutes the way old radiators do. I told him I wanted to think about it. There was something I needed to do first. Her 60th birthday party was in 3 weeks. She'd rented out a private room at a seafood restaurant on the bay, a place called Harbor Point, and she'd invited 30 people, family, church friends, neighbors. She'd asked me to give a toast. She'd specifically asked me. She had called me on a Sunday afternoon and told me, in that velvet voice she used when she wanted something, that I was the man of the family now, that nobody else could do it the way I could. I had said yes. I would give a toast. I had rehearsed this silence for 6 months without knowing it was a rehearsal. The week before the party, she called me. It was around 10 at night. Her voice was strange, casual in a way that was trying too hard. The way she sounded when she was lying to a creditor on speakerphone. She said, "Nikki, the funniest thing, Brenda from the bank mentioned she saw you at First National last week. I didn't know you banked there." I held the phone for a second, and I made my voice very flat and tired, the way I sounded after a long shift. And I said, "Oh no, I was just helping a buddy cash a check. His bank was closed." She said, "Oh." She was quiet. I could hear her television in the background. One of her game shows. The studio audience clapping at something far away. She said, "Your father used to bank there, you know." I said, "Did he?" She said, "Long time ago." "Well, good night, Nikki," and she hung up. I sat there with the phone in my hand, and I realized she knew. She didn't know what I knew, but she knew I'd been there, and she was scared. For the first time in my life, my mother was scared of me. I held that thought in my hand like it was a small, warm thing, and I did not let it go. I spent the next 2 weeks getting ready. I made copies of everything. 3 sets, one for Marcus, one for a safe deposit box of my own at a different bank, one for the inside pocket of the jacket I would wear to the restaurant. I called Pauline. I asked her to meet me for coffee, and I sat across from her at a little place in Ghent called The Daily Grind, where the windows fogged from the espresso machine and the chairs were mismatched. And I slid one of the copies across the table to her, between her saucer and the small ceramic creamer, and I watched her face go gray. Her hands went around the coffee cup the way a person grabs a railing. I said, "Pauline, I'm not asking you to do anything. I just want you to know what I know." She looked at the forged claim denial for a long time. Her eyes moved across the signature line twice. Then she said, in a voice that sounded like it was coming from underwater, "I have been waiting for this day for 18 years. She told me everything. How my mother had asked her to come to the house in 2006 and witness her signature on the denial letter, telling her it was a routine document, telling her it was just a formality for the funeral home. How Pauline had realized later, when my mother bought a new car in cash 3 months after the funeral, that something was wrong. How she had been too scared to say anything, because my mother had threatened to tell Pauline's husband about an affair Pauline had ended years earlier. How she had carried it all this time, and how it had eaten her up. She said the word eaten, and her hand went to her stomach, like the word was literal. I asked her if she would be at the party. She said yes. I said, "If I do what I'm planning to do, will you stand up with me?" She closed her eyes for what must have been 30 seconds. Her lashes were wet when she opened them. She said, "Yes, Nicholas. Yes, I will." The party was on a Saturday in December. Harbor Point, the private room overlooking the bay, the windows full of gray water, and the kind of low winter sun that turns everything copper. I remember the way the light bent through the wine glasses on the table, splintering into small, bright shapes on the white tablecloth. The room smelled like butter and old wood and the faint salt that gets into every building on that side of the bay. My mother wore a blue dress and a pearl necklace I had paid for. She was holding court at the head of the long table, laughing, accepting compliments, pretending she was 60 years old by accident and not by sheer chronological force. Rachel was there with her husband. My Aunt Deborah was there, sitting 2 seats down on the right, her hands folded in her lap. Pauline was at the far end, near the window, in a charcoal cardigan. And she did not touch her wine. 30 people, the way she'd planned it. Gloria smiled when she saw me at the party. That smile was the last real one she would ever give me. I waded through the salads. I waded through the entrees. I counted the tines on my salad fork twice. I waded through her best friend's toast and the church pastor's toast, and my uncle's rambling toast about how Gloria had raised 2 children alone. He used the word alone 3 times. I made a small mark on the tablecloth with my thumbnail each time, where no one could see. When the waiter cleared the entree plates, the soft scrape of china against china going around the table, my mother looked at me and tilted her head and said, in that performative voice she used in public, "Nikki, sweetheart, did you want to say a few words?" I stood up. I had the letter folded in my inside jacket pocket, against my heart, the same place my father had kept the key. I had a copy of the insurance policy in a folder under my chair. My hands were not shaking. That surprised me. I had expected them to. They were the steadiest they had been in months. I said, "I'd like to read something. It's a letter. From my father." He wrote it in 2005 on his last deployment, and he hid it in a safe deposit box at First National Bank, along with a $740,000 life insurance policy that named me as the sole beneficiary. I've only recently learned about its existence. I'm going to read it now. The room went silent, in a way I've never experienced before or since. Even the chandelier light seemed to dim, though it didn't, of course. Someone's water glass tinked against a plate. A chair creaked. My mother's face did something I didn't know a face could do. It tried to hold the smile and failed. The smile slid off in pieces. First the eyes, then the cheeks, then the mouth, which stayed open in the shape of the last word she'd said. Her hand went to her throat, to the pearls, and she gripped them like they could anchor her. Rachel was staring at me with her mouth slightly open. Her husband had set down his fork. Pauline, at the far end, took her napkin off her lap and laid it flat on the table next to her plate, smoothing it once. I unfolded the letter and I started to read. I read the part about her, about what she would do, about how he knew. My voice did not shake. I'd practiced. I read the part where he named her by name. I heard somebody at the table draw in a breath. I got to the line where he said, "I am sorry I couldn't protect you from her while I was alive." And my mother stood up so fast her chair fell backward and hit the carpet with a soft, heavy thump, and she lunged across the table and tried to grab the paper out of my hand. Her bracelet caught the edge of a water glass and tipped it. I stepped back. I held it up over my head. She was screaming. "Nicholas, stop it! Stop it! This is not the place! You don't know what you're doing!" My uncle stood up and put a hand on her arm and said, "Gloria, sit down." She didn't sit down. She was breathing hard. Her chest was rising and falling, and the pearls were jumping with it. She looked around the room and she said, "This is a lie. He's making this up. He's always been jealous of his sister. He's always been unstable. He has his father's temper. This is not what happened." "Somebody," she said, "somebody tell him." Tell him. Nobody told me anything. Nobody moved. And then Pauline stood up. She stood up slowly, holding the edge of the table with both hands. She was 71 years old and her hands were trembling, but her voice was clear, and it carried in that room the way a bell carries across water. She said, "Gloria, I watched you forge the claim denial. I was there. You asked me to witness it, and I did. And I have carried it for 18 years. And I am done covering for you. I am done. I'm sorry, Nicholas. I am so sorry. I should have told you when you were 18. I should have told you when you were 20. I should have told you 100 times and I didn't. And that is on me too. And I will carry that until I die. But I am telling you now. The room was completely silent. I counted the seconds before anyone spoke. 43. I know because I was watching the second hand on the wall clock behind my mother's head, a brass clock with a fake nautical wheel around the face, and I watched it sweep from one position past another, 3/4 of the way around. Even my mother stopped breathing for a moment. Her mouth was open. Her eyes were moving from face to face around the table, looking for the one person who would still defend her, and finding nothing but downcast eyes and stiffened shoulders. Then she screamed. She actually screamed, this awful sound, not a word, just a sound, like an animal that had stepped into a trap. And then she said, "Everything I did was for this family. Everything I did was for you. And I want you to understand how thin and false that sounded in a room full of people who had just heard the truth." Her voice cracked on the word family. It came out broken in 2 pieces. Nobody moved. Nobody comforted her. My Aunt Deborah was crying quietly, one hand over her mouth, the other gripping the stem of her wine glass so hard her knuckles had gone white. Rachel was looking at my mother like she had never seen her before, like a stranger had wandered into the seat. My uncle let go of her arm and stepped away. He took a full step back, then another. My mother stood there in her blue dress and in the restaurant I had paid for, and she looked around the room for someone, anyone, to take her side. And there was nobody. There was nobody. "Mom?" somebody said softly from across the table. A cousin, maybe. But it was the kind of soft that wasn't reaching for her. It was the soft of a person backing out of a room. I folded the letter back up along its original creases. I slid it into my inside pocket. I let the silence sit on the table between us for one more breath. I said, "Happy birthday, Mom." I picked up my coat from the back of my chair. I walked out of the restaurant. I did not look back. I heard her say my name once as I reached the doorway. Nicholas. Just that. I kept walking. The hostess at the front held the door for me without making eye contact. Like she knew. Somehow. Like the silence had traveled out of the private room and through the walls. The cold off the bay hit me in the face, and I took the first full breath I had taken in 18 years. I drove home, and I sat in my truck in the parking lot of my apartment building for an hour, just looking at my hands on the steering wheel before I went upstairs. They were not shaking. They had not shaken once. Monday morning, I went to my bank and I stopped every automatic payment that went to her. The mortgage, the car payment, the credit card, the insurance, the utility auto pays I had set up years ago and forgotten about. The teller looked at me when I asked her to cancel the 7th one, and I said, "All of them, please. Every single one with that account number." And she said, "Yes, sir." And her voice was kind. I called the utility companies and took my name off her accounts. I called the credit card company and closed the card she'd been an authorized user on. I called Marcus and told him to proceed with civil recovery against the insurance carrier and a separate action against my mother for the 18 years of fraudulent transfers. He said it would take time. I said I had time. I had nothing but time now. I had given her 14 years of mine. I could spend a year taking it back. She called me 41 times in the first week. I counted. I let it go to voicemail every time. The voicemails moved through stages. Anger first. "How dare you? After everything I did, you will regret this." Then bargaining. "Nikki, baby, just call me back. Let's talk. We can work this out." Then crying. Long, wet voicemails where she couldn't get a sentence out. Then threats about her health, her blood pressure, her heart, the chest pains she said she was having, then a long, soft one, 6 minutes long, where she said she had only ever loved me and that she had made mistakes, that she would explain everything, that I needed to come over and talk to her. I didn't go. I didn't call back. I let the silence do what silence does. By the 3rd week, the calls slowed. By the 5th week, they stopped. The silence I had been afraid of my whole life turned out to be the most peaceful sound I had ever heard. Within 4 months, she lost the house. The mortgage company foreclosed. I watched the notice go up online, a public record, a small black and white photo of the front porch where I had sat as a boy. The car was repossessed in February, hauled out of her driveway at 6 a.m. by a flatbed truck. A neighbor told Rachel about it. The neighbor said she had watched my mother run out in her bathrobe with her hair in curlers and pound on the truck window, and the driver had not even rolled it down. She called Rachel for help. Rachel called me, crying, asking what she should do. I told Rachel that I loved her and that this was not her problem, and that if she gave our mother a single dollar, she would never get it back, and that I would understand whatever she chose to do, but I would not be participating. Rachel didn't give her the money. Rachel said later that she had looked at her own bank account, sitting at her kitchen table with the statement printed out, and realized that helping our mother would mean her own kids didn't get summer camp, and that for the first time in her life, she had said no to her, and that she had cried for 2 days about it, but she had not changed her mind. The church group, which had organized an annual Christmas fundraiser for my mother for the past 9 years to help her with her property taxes, did not organize one that year. Word had gotten around. The pastor called Pauline to ask if it was true that all that money my mother had been giving to the building fund had actually come from her son's paychecks, and Pauline confirmed it. The pastor did not call my mother back. Her name came off the prayer list in the bulletin in February. Her name came off the volunteer roster for the spring rummage sale in March. By April, she was no longer welcome at the Tuesday Bridge Club after a quiet vote that nobody told her about until she showed up with her usual cookies and found the chairs already full. 6 months after the birthday party, my mother showed up at my apartment. I came home from work, and she was sitting on the steps outside my building. She had lost weight, maybe 15 pounds. Her cheekbones stood out. Her hair was different, grayer, not styled, pulled back with a plain brown clip. She was wearing a coat I did not recognize, something thin, secondhand. She looked at me and she said, "Nikki, please." I sat down on the steps next to her. I left a foot of space between us. I didn't touch her. The concrete was cold through my jeans. I said, "Mom, what do you want?" She said, "I want to explain." I said, "You don't have to explain. I know what happened." She said, You don't know everything. There were reasons. Your father wasn't who you think he was." I held up my hand. I said, "Mom, stop. I don't want to hear it. I'm not going to be cruel to you. I'm not going to call the police, but I am also not going to listen to any more stories. I would like you to leave now." She started to cry. The tears went down her face without her wiping them. She said, "I'm your mother." I said, "Yes, you are, and I am leaving." She sat there for another minute, looking at her hands, and then she got up and walked down the block to where her friend was waiting in a car to pick her up because she didn't have her own car anymore. I watched her go. The brake lights came on at the corner, and then they were gone. I went inside. I poured myself a glass of water. I drank it standing at the sink, looking out the window at the streetlight until the glass was empty. She tried one more time, about a year later. She wrote me a long letter, 12 pages, handwritten on lined paper that had been torn out of a spiral notebook. the little curls of paper still attached along the left edge. I started to read it, and I realized about 3 pages in that it was the same letter she had written for 20 years, just with different words. Everything was somebody else's fault. Everything she had done had been because of what someone else had done first. My father had driven her to it. I had driven her to it. Pauline had driven her to it. There was no admission anywhere in 12 pages, no apology, no acknowledgement of what she had taken. I read the whole thing because I owed her at least that much, and then I put it in a drawer, and I have not opened the drawer since. She lives now in a small apartment in Portsmouth that Rachel helps her with sometimes. She has not seen the inside of my home. She has not met anyone I have dated since. She is alive. She is, by all accounts, miserable. That is not my project anymore. The settlement with the insurance carrier came through about a year after the party. They paid the policy in full, with interest, because their fraud detection had failed, and they knew it. After Marcus's fees and the taxes, I cleared just over $620,000. I paid off the loan she had taken in my name. I paid off my truck. I bought a small house in a neighborhood near the shipyard, a 2-bedroom with a garage big enough for a workbench. The first night in it, I slept on the floor in the living room, because the bed had not been delivered yet. And I lay there listening to the refrigerator hum and the radiator tick, and I thought, this is mine. I put the rest in investments, and I did not touch it. I went back to work the Monday after the closing. I still fix diesel engines. I still have good hands. I have been seeing a woman named Claire for about 8 months now. She is a nurse at Centaura. She works the night shift sometimes, and she comes over in the morning, still smelling like the hospital. That mix of disinfectant and clean cotton. And she falls asleep on my couch with her shoes still on. She knows the whole story. The first night I told her, sitting on that same couch, with 2 mugs of tea going cold on the coffee table, she cried. And then she got angry. And then she got quiet for a long time. And then she reached across the couch and put her hand on mine and said, "Nicholas, I am so glad you found that key." She has met my sister. She has not met my mother, and she will not. Rachel and I talk every couple of weeks, sometimes on the phone. Sometimes she drives down on a Sunday with the kids. We are slowly rebuilding something. It will never be what it could have been, but it is something. Her kids call me Uncle Nick. They are 7 and 4. I'm teaching the older one the names of tools. Last Saturday, he handed me a 1/4-inch socket without being asked, and I had to turn around for a second so he wouldn't see my face. The peacoat hangs on the back of my bedroom door. I see it every morning when I wake up, and every night before I turn off the light. Some mornings I press my face into the collar, and I swear I can still smell diesel and salt. It is mostly my imagination now, but it doesn't matter because the memory of the smell is its own kind of presence. I miss a man I barely got to know. I've spent the past year reading everything I can find about him. I went to the Navy Archives in Washington and pulled his service record. A thick stack of paper in a manila folder, every duty station, every commendation, every page initialed in his hand. I tracked down 2 of his shipmates and took them to dinner. They told me he talked about me all the time. One of them, a man named Frank, who is now 78 and lives in Suffolk, told me that my father had shown him a picture of me when I was 12, standing next to a boat engine, and had said, "That's my boy. He's going to be a hell of a mechanic someday." Frank said my father had said that with a kind of pride he didn't show often. Frank's hands shook when he passed me the photograph he had kept all these years, folded once down the middle, the corners soft with age. Frank said it like it was a gift he had been carrying for me for 19 years, waiting for the right time to hand it over. I sat down at my kitchen table one night last spring, with the peacoat draped over the chair next to me, and I wrote my father a letter. I told him what had happened. I told him about Pauline standing up. I told him about the house I had bought, the garage, the workbench, the way the morning light comes through the small window over the bench and lands on the vise. I told him about Claire. I told him I had read his letter so many times I knew it by heart. I told him I was sorry I'd believed her for so long. I told him I understood now that he had loved me. I told him I loved him too, that I always had, that the boy on the workbench with the swinging legs had loved him and had never stopped, even when he was told to. I signed it, your son, Nicholas, and I folded it up, and I put it in the inside pocket of the peacoat, against the lining, near where the key had been. It is still there. It will stay there. I want to tell you what I learned, because I think you came here for more than just a story. I used to think that family meant the people who shared your blood deserved your loyalty, no matter what they did with it. I was wrong about that. Loyalty is earned, even by mothers, even by people who fed you when you were small. The fact that someone gave you life does not entitle them to spend yours. I used to think that love and obligation were the same thing. They are not. Love is when someone wants you to be free. Obligation is when someone wants you to stay. My father loved me. My mother needed me. Those are not the same, and I will never confuse them again. I used to think that the dead were gone, fully gone, with nothing left to give. I was wrong about that too. My father reached across 19 years and saved my life with a piece of paper in a metal box. The dead can love you. The dead can protect you. The dead can be more present in the truth than the living are in their lies. If you are listening to this, and there is someone in your family who has built a story around you, who has needed you to believe something about yourself, or about someone you loved, so that you would keep paying in money or time or shame, I want you to know that the truth is probably out there somewhere, in a coat, in a box, in a friend who's been carrying a secret for too long, in a question you were never allowed to ask. Ask it. Look for it. You are not a burden. You never were. The people who told you that needed you to believe it. That is the only reason it ever sounded true. That's the story. That's all of it. One peacoat with a brass key sewn into the lining. One letter from a man who had been gone for 19 years. One best friend who finally stood up when it mattered. If any of this hit close to home for you, if you have your own coat or your own key or your own story you have been carrying alone, drop a comment below and tell me. I read them. I read all of them. Hit the subscribe button if you haven't yet, because there are more stories like this coming, and the more of us who find each other here, the less alone any of us has to be. According to the Federal Trade Commission, financial elder abuse and family identity fraud accounts for over $28 billion in losses every year in this country. And the ARP estimates that as many as 1 in 10 Americans over the age of 50 has been a victim of financial exploitation by a family member. You are not the only one. You were never the only one. Take care of yourself this week. Press your face into the collar of whatever coat your loved one left you, if you have one, and remember that the love